All right, guys, it's time for some more legal definitions with Hawk. I'm Hawk. It is Tuesday, April 1st. It's about 5:20 p.m. On the West Coast. And seen some things going around on the app over the last few days, and I thought it would be a good idea to come on and give some legal definitions for a couple of terms. Consent and informed consent. I'm going to focus primarily on informed consent, and what I'm going to go through in this video is I'm going to talk about where you primarily see that term used in medicine or in the law, and how it has that term has made its way into relationships and sexual relationships with people, and what informed consent within the context of sex and relationships means, and what it means when there is not informed consent, and how all of that can be complicated by if there is the added layer of the non-disclosure of an STD. And so that's what we're going to go through in this video. I hope you find it informative. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments and I can do follow-ups. So the concept of informed consent has primarily historically been within kind of the arena of medical ethics, medicine, medical law, and things like that. And to read a definition, it means that a person must have sufficient information and understanding before making decisions about accepting risk, such as in medical care, surgeries, operations, experimental treatments, things like that. Informed consent is also something that's very important in my world as a trial attorney, as a civil litigator. When I'm discussing with a client, settling a case for a certain amount or on certain terms, or if we're discussing settling a case during a mediation, my job in that circumstance is to make sure that my clients have every piece of information they need to have in order for them to make an informed decision. And if they're going to consent to a settlement offer, that the consent that they're giving is fully informed. So what are some of the requirements of informed consent? As it relates to the medical world, and this is, for example, we're going to get into some other things here in a moment. Obtaining informed consent in medicine is a process that should include describing the proposed intervention or treatment, emphasizing the patient's role in decision-making, discussing alternatives to the proposed intervention or surgery or something like that, discussing the risks and benefits of the proposed treatment, and clearly eliciting and paying attention to the patient's preference after they've been given all of that information. Informed consent has to be clear and unambiguous. It has to be continuous, because consent can be revoked at any time, as we're about to discuss. It has to be conscious, and it has to be free of coercion or deception, because informed consent that involves deception is not consent at all. Deception eradicates consent, whether it's medicine, sex, relationships. We're going to talk about that a bunch. When it comes to sexual relationships or romantic relationships, consent defined explicit approval and permission to engage in sexual activity demonstrated by clear actions, words, or writings. Informed consent is freely and voluntarily given. It is mutually understood by all parties involved. If coercion, deception, intimidation, threats, and or physical violence are used, there is no consent. If deception is used, there is no consent. Sexual consent is consent to engage in sexual activity. In many jurisdictions, in every jurisdiction, sex without consent is considered rape or sexual assault. obtaining consent for sexual activity through deception is a serious issue, as deception invalidates the consent and renders that act non-consensual. And, it's like willfully withholding information from a potential sexual partner that would be relevant to them in their making a decision whether or not to consent to having sex with you. If you have a piece of information that would bear on their decision-making process, and you withhold that piece of information, and they have consent to have sex with you, but that if you had given them that piece of information that they would not have had sex with you, that's consent through deception, and that validates the consent that they've freely given. And it's simply, some of it is obvious, and that can be a crime in many jurisdictions in the United States. It's like, are you married? Are you singled? Are you unattached? Are you sleeping with any other people? Do you have any STDs? Pretty basic stuff. And it's like, if you have an answer to one of those questions in your head, and you think that if the other person had that piece of information, they would not consent to have sex with you, and you withhold that piece of information, or you lie in an answer to one of those questions, then you've obtained their consent through deception, and everything that you've done with them is non-consensual on their part, if they had that information. And a lot of times, if people discover that piece or those pieces of information afterwards, then they know that you have engaged in non-consensual sexual activity with them, or non-consensual romantic relationships. It's all about your knowledge and your intent when you are trying to obtain consent from another person for them to sleep with you or to be in a relationship with you. If the person months or weeks later is like, if I had known that piece of information before we had sex, I would not have consented to have sex with you. And deep down, you know what those pieces of information are. And you know when you're withholding them, and you know when you're lying about them. Because this stuff is not accidental. It's never accidental. It's always intentional. And it doesn't even matter what that piece of information is. It doesn't matter what you think about that piece of information. What matters is about what your potential partner thinks about that information. It could be a huge piece of information. It could be something that you think is very small. But if you've withheld it from them, then they didn't get to make that choice. Deception invalidates consent. Examples of deception. Misrepresenting somebody's identity. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Falsely claiming to have a certain status or condition, like falsely claiming that you're not in a relationship, or falsely claiming that you're not married, or falsely claiming that you don't have an STD, and making false promises or claims to another person in order to induce them to consent to having sex with you. Again, that can be a crime, and it can lead to civil lawsuits, and it can lead to going to jail. And again, it goes back to just those basic questions and answering honestly the questions that a potential partner is asking you. If somebody is asking you these questions and you are giving them dishonest answers, you're doing that for the purpose of inducing them to consent to having sex with you, which is no consent at all. It's often also referred to as rape by deception, because non-consensual sex, by definition, to most people in the United States, is rape. And it's a situation in which the perpetrator deceives the victim into participating in a sexual act to which they would otherwise not have consented had they not been deceived. And here's the thing, and I'm gonna use a word here that some people might find to be a bit inflammatory. Predators are extremely creative and manipulative in their deceptions and in the methods and modes of deception that they employ. These deceptions are usually very well thought out plans, and when executed successfully, predators often get as much of a rush through the successful deception as they do from the sex. Nothing about any of this is accidental or, gee, I didn't know. Nothing about this is careless. It is almost always, always, always very intentional, these acts of deception and the results that they're trying to get. Now, as I was going through and putting together this outline, I remembered a movie that I saw when I was a kid, Revenge of the Nerds. And, you know, in that movie, there's like a very pretty cheerleader who's from one sorority, and she's dating the quarterback for the football team who's in a fraternity. And one of the nerds sees the two of them have an argument one night at a costume-themed party event, and the boyfriend quarterback leaves. The nerd grabs that guy's costume, I think he was dressed as like Darth Vader or something, goes in to that area and has sex with the cheerleader, and she thinks she's having sex with her quarterback boyfriend. He pulls off the mask, and in the movie, she's not upset and praises him for his sexual prowess. I think today that would be considered to be problematic. I would guess that that scene would not be shot today or released for all the reasons that we're talking about now. So, and I found one reference that in the book of Genesis in the Bible, Jacob is tricked into sleeping with Leah instead of her sister, Rachel. So it's even in the Bible. Yeah. So what if an STD is involved? Intentionally failing to disclose that you have an STD to a person that you're sleeping with can lead to both criminal and civil consequences. It depends on knowledge and consent, depends on the jurisdiction. But typically, you know, many states have laws that criminalize the intentional transmission of STDs. In every state, you can sue someone civilly for doing that to you as well. But typically, you need to prove that the person knew they had an STD. Well, how do people know that they have an STD? You could be diagnosed with it by a doctor. You could experience symptoms and have a very good idea that you have an STD, even if you haven't been diagnosed by a doctor. Or you could have a former partner come to you and say, hey, you infected me with an STD. Again, you've been put on notice in all three of those circumstances. In two of them, even if you've not been formally tested or diagnosed by a doctor. And so proof of knowledge of an STD. Then you prove they intentionally or recklessly engaged in sexual activity with another person without telling that person that they likely have an STD or have been diagnosed with an STD. And then that other person contracts that STD, gets diagnosed, and has to receive treatment. That's the typical framework under a criminal statute. Again, depends on the state, depends on the jurisdiction. What about for civil liability? It would be, typically that would be a negligence case unless you live in a state or a jurisdiction that has a civil penalty statute that's on point. And some of those exist, but there's not a ton of them. But essentially it would be a negligence claim. A person had a duty to disclose to you that they had an STD. They breached that duty in failing to disclose that to you. That breach and the resulting sexual activity caused the other person to contract an STD, and that other person suffered damages as a result. And typically in a civil lawsuit, you could sue that person and recover for those damages. And that includes like economic damages, for medical bills, prescriptions, co-pays for doctor visits, things like that. You can also sue for non-economic damages, which is like pain and suffering, embarrassment, emotional type things. But again, it's like you would need to check the laws in the state and the jurisdiction where you live. And so, again, it's like employing deception at any stage of any of this stuff obliterates the consent that the other person has given. If their consent was obtained through deception, they did not consent. And any sex that came after that was non-consensual, period. Hope that helps. Let me know if you have any comments on the question or questions in the comments.